Hey, good morning and welcome to the first episode in 2022 of Talking to Artists. Basically a very casual podcast designed for artists to be able to understand a little bit about how to build your business and some art tips and things like that. And also for collectors to understand a bit about what goes on behind the scenes of a working artist. So I just want to say hello from my cottage, and it's been a wonderful holiday, and I'm still in the process of doing my newsletter that talks about all the recap of last year, lots of wins, lots of craziness, and plans for this new year. So working on that. Right now we're stranded at the cottage because we're totally snowed in, which is kind of a weird experience. Not something that doesn't normally happen in modern day life. But anyway, very excited to bring on Celine Gabrielle. So she's an artist from Nova Scotia, contemporary pop artist, very influenced by color. So I'm sure we'll have lots to talk about. So let me just bring her right on. And there she is. Hello.
How are you
today? I'm good. I'm just going to turn my sound up a little bit. Oops.
There, I think that's better.
Yeah, of course, I forgot all of my my earbuds and all that kind of stuff in the city. So I'm here kind of at the cottage trying to go, okay, what do I have? This really old, cheap, ear set that try to make work.
Well, you said that, and I've never done it with AirPods, so I didn't bother putting it in because I didn't know how good the sound was. So I don't even have AirPods, whatever. Anyway, hopefully you can hear me.
Yep, you're good. You're going to have to talk a bit loud. You're a bit soft.
Okay, I'll talk louder.
Or sit closer.
Okay, I can do that too.
Anyway, I want to thank you so much for joining me. So you're episode number 81, but the first of 2022. So that's cool. I kind of was a bit of a slacker over the holidays, but it was kind of nice to take a bit of a break.
Yeah, it's always good to take a break.
Yeah, I think so. The problem, though, is I find that the longer break I take, the more I think, oh, I'll just continue to take more breaks. So I'm finding I don't know about you, but I'm finding it hard to kind of get motivated to move forward. I find I'm doing a lot of pseudo-organizing and pseudo-planning and moving stuff around and rearranging my studio for the 17th time without really making any impact.
That happens. I think January is a little bit like that, especially in Canada, too, because we've had I don't like winter anyway, and then we've had a few big dumps of snow, and it just makes you feel a little like hunkering down a bit. So,
Yeah. Well, and I find too, for me sometimes, I normally live in Toronto, but I'm at the cottage north of Kingston. And I find that and we are truly snowed in, like I cannot get out until someone comes and plows the driveway, right? Yeah. So we tried yesterday, and I'm like, yeah, the car's not going to make that. But I do find that what that does for me is it's a little bit of a well, I can just kind of hide away, so you kind of, but I'm getting back to real life. So you're my motivation to actually, put some makeup on, wash my hair, be a real person for a bit.
Relatable. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about you. So I understand you did art sort of in high school and then took a long break from it and then kind of came back to it in a bang at the Artist Project as the emerging artist, or as the kind of a people's choice in the Untapped. You're based in Nova Scotia, inspired by the 80s, love the 80s, lived through the 80s, lots of big hair in the 80s.
Yeah, all of that.
So tell me a bit about yourself then.
Yeah, I grew up in Ottawa. And I was very artsy as a kid growing up. And then I applied to go to Canterbury, which is an arts high school. And so they had a pretty elaborate arts program. And I got a wide variety of exposure from life drawing to printmaking, photography, painting, ceramics. It is a public school. Like, it's an amazing program. Anybody in that area into the arts? And they have all the arts, like performing arts, dance, music, you name it. Anyway, great experience. But towards the end, when I was looking at what's next after high school, and I did want to go to NASCAD because I have a lot of extended family in Nova Scotia, which is kind of why I'm here now. So I looked into NASCAD, and I'm not great with math, but I knew enough to like look at the Canadian census at the time and what fine artists were making, and then what it was going to cost me to go to NASCAD. And it was like a huge discrepancy. And I just freaked out a little bit. Like I got scared that, I don't know, I was going to be in debt forever, or I really love making art, but I didn't want to make what other people wanted me to make. I just wanted to make what I wanted to make. And I thought, oh, you know, to be successful, I'm probably going to have to, I don't know, do something that maybe isn't what I want to do. And so I just made the decision that I wasn't going to pursue that. And I had a bit of a hard time, to be honest. Like the year after I graduated, and I wasn't sure what I was doing with my life, which I think a lot of teenagers, or maybe at any age of life, we're still trying to figure it out. I don't know. But anyway.
Well, I think it's always hard when you're looking at following a path that's untraditional. Like I went right into fine arts program, and I have to say I didn't do anywhere near as much research as you did, partially maybe because I come from a family of artists, so it seemed like, okay, well, people can actually have that as a real life job. It was only when I graduated that was like, oh, holy shit, like I've just spent 4 years doing art, having an awesome time, but what do I do now? Because none of the art courses train you to how to do the business part of it, or how to actually go out there and make art that's going to actually allow you to potentially have a mortgage.
Right. Yeah. So anyway, I went on a total fluke, actually. I was just like, being sad and depressed at home. And so my loving mom, in an effort to like cheer me up, she sent me to the spa for the day to get a manicure. And in that hour, talking to the esthetician and like really liking the environment, I thought, well, maybe this is something I could do. Anyway, so long story short, I had a 20-year career doing aesthetics. I started in Ottawa.
Wow.
Yeah. I went to school. I became an esthetician. I worked at a bunch of large day spas. And then since I never went away for university or anything, I'm like, okay, I'm done with Ottawa. I need a change of scenery, which is what brought me to Nova Scotia. So then I moved out here, continued to work in aesthetics in Halifax. And then I decided I'm done working for other people. I'm going to work for myself. So I moved to right where my family is, which is Wolfville, which is a tiny 4,000 person town. And I worked for somebody else temporarily. And then I opened my own day spa business. And so I ran that for about just over 10 years. And yeah, and that went really well. Actually.
Impressive.
Yeah, I loved it. It was successful. The biggest challenge I had was finding staff. So I was trying to grow the business, but I just could never find staff. And so ultimately I downsized. And then by the end, I was working alone. So I was working a lot and started developing a wrist condition, which came to find out I didn't develop. I had it my whole life. It's called Madelung's deformity. It's something you're born with. It's just wrist pain. Like it's not carpal tunnel, but people understand carpal tunnel. So it's kind of like that kind of pain. And so I went to all the specialists and they're like, you need to do something different or find more staff, which I couldn't do. So, so that was another really big moment in my life. And the big part of where the art comes in is when I didn't pursue it professionally, I thought, oh, that's okay. I'll make art on my downtime.
Let me guess, you did almost nothing in the 10 years you had your own business.
You got it. I basically, so for my business, I was creative because I was doing the graphic design for marketing, and I had children, and we do homemade Halloween costumes and decorating, you know what I mean? Like I renovated houses, and that's I think how I kept my creativity going. But in terms of my love, which is painting, I just didn't paint. I thought about it a lot, and I would go to gallery, anytime we travel, we'd go to galleries, and I would always have it around and be inspired by it, but I just wasn't getting out my ideas in that way.
And so I gather then that the painting doesn't bother your wrist the same way as your doing aesthetics did.
Yeah. So aesthetics, I was doing a lot of body treatments and facials. And so there was a lot of neck and shoulder massage and stuff. And so I'll just like, it's anything when you're like pressing like that with your full body weight, that's where I get issues. But I paint with I'm not like a kind of like a very
light brush.
yeah. Very gentle painter. So it doesn't, I mean, they bother me because it's just a condition I have. So I have to be mindful of that. I have the braces and all that good stuff. But when it comes to making art, it's not a problem.
And so how did you find, obviously the transition was kind of forced upon you to a certain degree because you couldn't find staff and your pain was such that you couldn't continue. So did you kind of transition? Like your story is very similar to mine because I actually had a marketing firm, had a number of employees, and always intended to do the art. My sister is an artist, so every time I saw her produce something, I'm like, I should do that on my spare time. But we all know that as an entrepreneur, you never have any spare time, right?
Definitely.
And so transitioning that from one job to another can be sign of a challenge. Did you do it gradually, or did you just decide to hook, line, and sinker, jump in?
So still, I don't know what it was. Like in between, there was about 5 years in between shutting that down and then finally getting to art. And so I've always been like a goal-driven person, a career-oriented person. And so I wasn't happy just not having a career. So I immediately, instead of what I should have done actually was take some time to like grieve, because that was like a really big part. But I just jumped right into the next thing. So at that time, in addition to my like business for fun, I was teaching fitness classes at night. And so I decided, well, let me just transition into fitness since I'm kind of doing that already now. So I had like a whole 5 years when I still wasn't making art and I was teaching fitness classes at night. In the morning, I was doing like boot camps. And then in the middle of the day, I was doing like some personal training and coaching one-on-one with people. But it's funny because I'm actually like, that's not me at all. I wish I was like a fitness person, but it was something.
You sound pretty a fitness person, doing boot camps and such. Like,
no, I mean,
like, I would never go to that business.
I really, in my core, I like sitting and snacking and making art. Like, that's really who I am. So that 5 years of trying to really actively pursue this like fitness persona, I did okay. And I really enjoyed it. I'm not going to lie. I do enjoy, especially, I didn't like the coaching, but I did the one-on-one, like, no offense to anybody who is or loves it, but I just found like counting reps for people, that wasn't exciting. The group fitness stuff, I love that. But anyway, so I just wasn't really fulfilled with that either, because it just wasn't, you know what I mean? It just wasn't at my core who I truly.
Well, it probably satisfied your need. Obviously, you're an extrovert, so it satisfied your need for people and for connection and for having fun with people, but it didn't actually satisfy a deep core of being able to really create and do your own thing, right?
And actually, I am not an extrovert at all.
Oh, you seem like one. Good scammer.
No, I'm good. I feel like I'm good at, I love people, obviously, and I love camaraderie and community and chatting with people, but I really also need to be alone a lot, and I need to just be with myself and reflect on what's going on in my mind and around me and just have like quiet downtime. It's tricky with a family, and my husband's always like, yeah, good luck with that. Like, it's not realistic to just be like, I'd love to go, I'd have it in. So my eldest is 15 now. So in 15 years, I don't think I've ever, like, you know what I mean, gone to the cottage or something and been alone, but God, that'd be nice. Maybe one day I'll get back to that, you know. I don't appreciate it when you're young and single, but anyway.
Yeah, no, it's pretty cool.
Yeah.
You know, I have to say too, one of the coolest things that I've experienced recently is because it's been like minus 25 and with, you know, like really, really cold and super still. And it's amazing how it's entirely quiet. Like there are no birds, there's nothing walking in the forest. And it makes you realize how unusual it is to be surrounded by complete silence.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
That's a good point, because even yesterday, when I was walking the dog, I saw a squirrel. And it crossed my mind. I'm like, normally I see tons of them, but I haven't lately. So that's okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it didn't dawn on me until you said that everybody's kind of hunkered down and like trying to get through.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So anyway, I don't know where I was at. Oh yeah.
So how did you finally get to deciding, yep, I'm doing my art?
All right. So I was doing all this fitness stuff. I wrote and self-published a book about like fitness and weight loss. Like I did all this crazy stuff in that time frame. But again, it just was like, my husband is like my number one fan and also my sounding board. So all through this like 20-year period, I was always talking to him, oh, I should make art, you know. So he heard me incessantly talk and never take action. So finally, you know, I was just feeling like it wasn't, what I was doing wasn't really what I wanted to do or very sustainable. And so we're having a little heart to heart. And he's like, oh my God, just make some art already. Like, what are you waiting for? And I'm like, yeah. You're right. And it still took me like a month after that talk to take action. So finally, I don't know, again, more talk. And I guess that talk really set in. So I scrounged around in the house and I did have like some crappy watercolors and a bit of paper and some few little things. And even though I wasn't creating, like I said, I had always been thinking. So one night everybody went to bed. So I was alone, which is what I like. And I got out my little stuff. And I took a little corner of the rec room and put a little table. And I just did this small, probably 9x12 or something, painting in watercolor. And I loved it. I loved doing it. I loved the finished result. And so from there, for whatever reason, all the stars aligned, I just kept experimenting. So really the first 2 years, so before the artist project in 2020, for 2018, 2019, I basically just experimented again. I watched YouTube videos. I wanted to, so the arts high school that I went to was always water, right? So acrylic, watercolor, anything water-based, basically. We weren't allowed to use oils. Mm-hmm. But I felt like I always fought the medium until I finally started dabbling with oils. So first with oils, I just went to Michael's, bought a few things, and was trying to watch YouTube videos and figure it out. And then finally, I committed to a night class at NASCAD, the school I always wanted to go to.
Just a few years later.
Right, many, many years later. Anyway, it was an 8-week class, and they were quite long. They were like 3-hour classes, and I loved the teacher. Her name was Caitlin McGuire. She was great. And that was really the catalyst, because finally, once I figured out how to work with oils, it's just like a match made in heaven. Like, oils are my favorite and they work well for me, and I can accomplish what I'm trying to do. I can get, you know, it's so hard when you have the vision, but the materials don't let you create what's in your brain. And I just felt like with oil, it all clicked and I could get out what was inside.
I think, yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean. Because the first time I did a piece with a palette knife, the same thing. It's like, it truly was an epiphany. Like, it actually gives me goosebumps even now, because it was kind of like, you know, I've been dabbling and doing a bunch of stuff, photography, whatever. But then when I did the palette knife, it's like, yeah, I found my calling. I found the vehicle I need to be able to kind of communicate the way I want to with my art. And it's pretty cool when that happens.
It's so important, you know, like, don't get me wrong. Like, one of my favorite places is still the art supply store, and I'll get a little of this and dabble with that. It's fun to experiment. Mm-hmm. But there's something about this, like, connection with a certain medium that just makes everything else so much easier. And that was oil. Yeah. So it's interesting. Sorry, no, you go. No, you go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, first of all, I did want to talk about, obviously you have a huge influence with sort of fashion and color, but as I was listening to your podcast and stuff like that, and you kept referring to yourself as an emerging artist, I'm like, wow, you've come out to be a very sophisticated emerging artist. And it's interesting that now that I know their history, it's obvious that you've got all that business sense and understanding of brand and consistency and how to kind of create a business plan to be able to sell your work. So,
yeah, I think, so it's funny, like, I definitely think my years in business have been super helpful. And actually, I was just talking to my daughter, and, you know, one of her friends wants to go into a trade, and I'm like, great, that sounds good. Also, tell them to take business. Because, you know, no matter what you're doing, I really feel like business is super, super helpful. So, but it's interesting because the work that I brought to the artist project in Toronto, or that got me in, and then I brought, I didn't intend to like make a series, but I heard sort of similar to that from my booth mates and people passing like, oh, that it all really works together or whatever. But I think unintentionally thinking about it, even though like, and non-artists don't understand. Like often when I come to my studio for the first hour, I'll just like sit there and stare at like work in progress or literally into space because I'm like thinking or processing. And so I think
absolutely
that for 20 years. And so, you know, once I created, I knew what I actually wanted to create. Bear in mind that first 2 years of experimenting, I tried smaller works. I tried works on paper. I just wanted to see what I could create again. So there was still an experimentation period. But then when I decided, okay, I love oil, I love large, these are the ideas and themes and colors that I've just been thinking about forever, it all came together.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah.
I think that makes a lot of sense, because I do think sometimes I agree with you that my husband will kind of say, well, Tony, did you get anything done in the studio? I'm like, well, I did, but I spent like an hour and a half just noodling or spinning or, you know.
Yeah.
I'm not a huge doodler or sketcher. Like I have a weird way of working. I think I have this whole thing about not wanting to write everything down and not wanting to draw anything and just starting like just full in. But like you said, there's a lot of that percolating and planning that goes on in the head before you start.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I think the other thing too, though, and I can sort of say this from having, well, seen a lot of artists, but also having a small business as well, is it's one thing to be in business and have corporate experience. It's a very different thing to run your own business, because you've got your fingers in everything. And that is such a huge skill set to be able to take to any business, but especially I think the arts, because you know, so much of it really isn't actually about the creating, right? It's about getting the work out there, and it's about, you know, talking to clients and about selling the work and, you know, filing your tax returns and all that kind of crap.
Yeah, there's so much. And it's actually sometimes hard when you think how much time goes into the behind the scenes work. Like if you didn't have to do all that, if you could just create, like, oh my God, that would be amazing. I'd be way more prolific and I could explore all kinds of different ideas, you know. But you're right, that promotion, that sharing your work, that talking about your work, all of that, creating connections with other artists, building a network, like all of that stuff is so important. And I think for a lot of people, it's really hard. It can be challenging. Yeah.
I think you're right. I remember listening to an interview with this artist who was quite well established. And he was basically saying, if you're not spending 50% of your time on the business, you're not spending enough time. And it's kind of, so for me, sometimes that makes me feel better, because I feel like, yeah, it's probably about where it is. And I always feel like I never put enough time into the studio. But, you know, the reality is that you have to do that part to be able to continue to work in the studio. And I don't know about you, but I find actually there's a part of me that really likes the intellectual challenge of the business part of it and the strategy around kind of some of that as well. So I probably would miss that anyway. So.
Yeah, I think you're right. I do like that too. Like, well, again, so I've been self-employed when I was doing aesthetics. Well, okay, in the early parts I worked for other people, but then I was self-employed. And then when I was doing my fitness stuff, I was self-employed. And now again, I'm self-employed. So there is something about, and it's funny too, because when you talk to people who work like for the government and they're frustrated with something and you're like, well, why don't you blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, it has to go through so many layers. Like, oh my God, shoot me now. If I had to like get something okayed by like 5 different departments, it would never get done. Hence, you know,
or you'd constantly be in trouble, which is what happened to me. Like I worked in small entrepreneurial companies, but once things got a bit larger, they're like, well, you can't just do that, Kate. I'm like, why not? We all know what we're supposed to be doing. We all know the direction we're going in.
Right.
So,
I totally see that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, so you started doing your podcast. I saw Art OK Cool.
Yeah.
It's kind of a fun name. I listened to a few of them. They're really, they're great, and they're very candid, and definitely your energy comes through. But I think it's really neat too to do it from kind of the emerging artist point of view, because I think there's so many artists that are in the same boat, right? They've kind of done their career, they're wanting to do art for a long time, and now they're kind of getting into it and trying to figure out how to start it.
Yeah. So the idea with that came from my own frustration. Like when I was starting, and still now, I find that there are a lot of art or creativity podcasts that are fabulous at interviewing artists and hearing stories, which I love, and or are people who are like quite far ahead, or I don't know. I just wanted something where artists could tune in and listen. And Jade and I, so Jade is my co-host. Jade and I met at the Artist Project. We were booth buddies, so they partnered us up, and we just hit it off. And that's the only time we've met in real life, was at the Artist Project, because COVID. We haven't been able to get together again. But, you know, just in our conversations, I knew it was going to be a good, I think, because Jade is a very academic, and she went through, you know, different art programs and has a lot, and is a very smart person. And so she has a lot to offer that way. And she also has great energy. So when we decided to team up for the podcast, we wanted it like, we share mostly about a little bit about our day-to-day, like what's actually going on. So if you follow from the podcast, not saying you need to, but if you went back to the very first episode all the way through, every week you hear like, here's what's happened this week, and here's what happened, and this went well, and that didn't go well. And then we move on to like a topic of interest, like writing your CV. And so she has a bit more experience with that, because she's been working as a professional artist a little bit longer than me. And then so I'm like, oh, I didn't know that. And it's just an interesting dynamic, because we're both emerging, but I'm self-taught. She has a lot of higher education. And so it just I think it makes an interesting dynamic. And I know from people who have listened, the feedback we get is they like the relatability of it. And yeah, we're very casual, and there's a lot of swearing. So just be forewarned.
Yeah, I noticed that on your website. Well, but I think also you actually are going through it. So I think that's also makes it very personal, right? As opposed to a consultant kind of talking about how things should be or whatever, when they're so far removed from the actual day-to-day of dealing with some of these issues, right?
Yeah, like we're not trying to be the expert. We're saying, here's what we're trying. This worked, that didn't work, and then here's what we're gonna try next. Like it's more of that kind of vibe. Like, yeah, you feel like you're in it and just experimenting as we go along with us.
And you decided to do it as, this is a totally selfishly motivated question.
Yeah.
You decided to do it as a podcast versus something like this that was Instagram Live and YouTube and.
Well, I'm like a podcast addict. I love podcasts. And so it was my go-to, because I could listen to it while I'm working, while I'm walking the dog, while I'm being mom taxi. Whereas I find live, as much as I do like them sometimes, it's hard to like, I know video is the way that everybody wants to go, but I like video when I can focus, and yet most of the time I feel like I'm always trying to multitask. So for me, podcasts made sense, because that's how I consume a lot. And so I thought, okay, let me go that route. Although it's funny you say that, because we're just talking a little bit about maybe switching up the podcast and having it as a podcast, but also like a video version. So
you're going to go backwards to what I'm doing.
I'm going to go backwards. Yeah.
Well, I know it's interesting you say that, because the first ones I did were just because I wanted to just reach out to talk to people I didn't know, and because I find that fascinating. But very quickly, I kind of realized that the value of it was that people were just listening and not talking. So, you know, that's why I don't really address usually questions and comments and stuff like that, because otherwise, if you're just listening to it, you kind of lose the context of it.
Hey, that makes
because this is
sense.
So it's here now, and it's on Facebook and it's on YouTube, and then I'm just separating the audio and having it as a podcast, which of course would be way easier just to do the audio at the beginning, I guess.
No, but that's great. And with yours, I've listened to them. And I mean, you can put them on and not have to watch it, because
Well, that's the goal, I think. Like, to me, that's the goal. And then if you want to kind of go and say, oh my gosh, but what does Celine look like? And what is her art? And I can see it in the background. You have the opportunity to do that, right? But I also think that a lot of people, especially because they're an hour, people tend to be listening while they're doing other things and working in the studio and doing whatever. So that's kind of the plan. But, you know, again, plan and resources to actually get it all done are completely different things sometimes.
Oh my.
So so talk about, I don't know, your motivation then. I mean, how do you sort of figure out what you're going to do? You talked a lot about getting started, your artist pep rallies you're doing. It looks like you've got a lot of fingers and a lot of pies to kind of get things going and get yourself motivated, I guess.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess in terms of sorry, what was the question again? Like, what gets me going? What keeps me motivated?
Yeah, we were just talking. I really loved your artist pep rally, which I gather is a bit of a be a cheerleader, helps you get motivated, helps other people get motivated.
Yeah, so the pep rallies, I just started doing those. I love them. They're so much fun because it's sort of like, well, the group, like group fitness. It's like group arting. It's like cheering each other on, hyping each other up, sharing ideas. So I just get these small groups of artists together, and they come from a wide range of experience level, different, like I just actually got off one this morning, and some are in India and some are in the States and some are here. Like it's all over with all types of art. But what's amazing about them, like I kind of did it to see if anybody would be interested in that, because I'm a solo entrepreneur, solo artist. My studio is in my house. I'm alone a lot, which I told you earlier, I'm an introvert, so that's okay. But I also need that connection. So it was a way of like staying connected and also sourcing the knowledge from so many people. Because, for example, I might know one aspect, but there's a missing link of something that there's somebody in the art world that has that information. So it's a way of getting 6 artists together, and they're 90-minute sessions for 4 weeks. So it's quick and dirty. Like it's nice for like a pep rally, just hyping you up for a short period to maybe get you through something, or maybe get you going, or maybe helping you hash out an idea that you feel stuck in. And so we source, each person is in the spotlight for part of the call, and they share like what's going well, what they need help with. And then everybody else chimes in and says, well, here's what's working for me, or have you heard about that, or here's an idea. And so you're like taking notes and brainstorming. And then the next week we check back in with you. So there's some accountability there. Everybody each week has to sort of talk about, here's what I'm going to work on. And so then the next week you've got these 6 beautiful faces smiling at you saying, how did it go?
Well, did you do it?
Did you do it? And if you didn't, that's okay too. Like it's a really, well, you know, I'm kind of a casual, fun, lighthearted kind of person. So it's not taken too seriously, even though some of the information could be, you know, serious information. It's a casual kind of environment, but it's just, I just love it. It's so fun. And so I did it on a whim in November. The group that I did loved it. And so I opened up two different sessions, an evening session and a morning session for this month, and sold those out pretty quick. And so then I'm going to do it again in February. And as long as people are interested, I'm just going to keep going with it because it's fun for them. It's fun for me. It's helpful. And yeah, so we're just going to keep going with that.
Well, that's awesome. Yeah, no, I think it's a great idea. And I think that you touched on a really valuable point too, and especially with COVID, with everybody being so separated, even if you live in a city where you normally would have a network, is that kind of accountability. I have meetings like that every Monday too, where it's kind of like, you know, this is what, right now we're working on our kind of strategies for the year moving forward, but it's kind of, it keeps you, sometimes when you feel like you're kind of, I don't really feel like doing anything, it's like, oh, but I was supposed to deliver this. I was supposed to do, I don't know, figure out how to do a new reel or something. And then you kind of force yourself to do it, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, that accountability is key, I think. And the camaraderie, like, that was one of the things when I was starting out, thinking, oh, can I actually do anything? I'm self-taught. I'm in a small town. I'm older. It's another, you know, it's a new career. Like, will this actually help or happen? And it would have been nice back then to have a few people, you know, in a circle that maybe had big dreams too, and were doing things that I could commiserate with and get ideas from. So hopefully I can provide that for somebody else. And actually, I just was going to say one more thing. If anybody's listening and is interested in that, the other thing that I really love about my groups is that I only have 6. So it's a small, tight-knit groups. And I reserve one spot always for somebody who maybe can't afford it. And nobody knows who that person is. They're just in the mix like everybody else. But sometimes, again, when you're starting out, you know, it's expensive. And so you want to do trainings, you want to participate, and you can't afford it. And so there's always a spot. So if anybody thinks, oh, that sounds cool, but I can't, just reach out to me and we'll try to get you in a group anyway.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, that's great. Well, I think it's great that you're sort of thinking about the challenges you had when you were sort of starting off and trying to find sort of solutions for them too, which is really good.
For sure.
Yeah. And I think it's nice to be able to do some of this stuff. I mean, there is so much on the internet and there's so many courses, but sometimes you don't know what you're getting into, right? So it's kind of nice to be able to kind of have a bit of a trial to have that group. session to work. Yeah. So throughout all of the conversation so far today, I haven't heard anything about fashion, and yet you seem to be very, very motivated by fashion and color and stuff within your actual art. So how did that come about?
Okay. So yeah, always been into fashion. And it's funny because as I've been working, the more I've tried to figure out why is fashion so interesting or important to me? And sure, it's the colors and the textures and all that stuff. That's great. But at the core of it, it really stems back to when I was younger, and fashion was always just a part of my identity and showing up, because I never felt like I really fit in anywhere, you know, when I was growing up. So I did grow up in the 80s and 90s, and especially in the really young years, it was kind of like a bit preppy, and like the girls at my school had the long hair with a braid, and I had like a short asymmetrical haircut, and they were wearing like Laura Ashley florals, and I had like my sister's hand-me-down acid wash. But like that's what I was comfortable in, and even though it was unusual compared to my bubble, it made me feel like myself, if that makes sense. And so
absolutely, yeah, no, I totally get you. I went to Western, and I did like the whole goth thing at Western, where everyone else was wearing like, you know, shopped at Harry Rosen. So yeah, I get it. I get it totally.
I think I had a summer when I was like all black. But anyway, yes, experimenting with fashion and how it makes me feel, and then in high school, so when I was experimenting with like what would I do after high school, fashion was one of the other things. Like NASCAD was one dream, but like Parsons in New York for fashion design was like the crazy goal.
That'd be pretty awesome.
Obviously didn't happen. Anyway,
also hard to make a living at sometimes. I'm sure the census will tell you.
Yeah. So anyway, but I was making clothes for myself because just being my own person was always just important to me, and I never wanted somebody else to have what I had. And so it started from that, and then, you know, just through my life, looking at the people who have a strong identity and the clothes that they wear and how clothes help us show up. Like, you don't go to a wedding in your sweats, right? Like it's like a uniform. Like, we present for different environments, and I just find it fascinating. And culturally, like across the world, why people wear certain things for certain ceremonies and what it represents, and all of that I just find so interesting. So it just started with fashion, but now, like, the deeper I get, the more the work is trying to reflect, or the pieces that I'm choosing are pieces that tell a story. So maybe if you look at it, you don't know the whole story because you're just looking at the piece of art, but there's a lot of the paintings that are representative of things to people, and not necessarily that it's even theirs. Like, one dress that I painted was a vintage dress, and it was in the local shop here. I was walking by, and I'm like, oh my God, that dress is like stunning. It was from the 60s, and it was like this buttery yellow chiffon with like many, many layers of ruffles. And so just stunning. And then I went into the shop and I asked the owner, like, it was like this big, so it was never going to fit me, but so I couldn't wear it. But oh my God, I'd love to paint that. So I went in and I asked the owner, can I rent the dress so that I can photograph it for paintings? And she's like, well, I don't own it. It's on consignment. I'll get in touch with the owner, and if she'd like to work something out with you, then you guys can figure that out. So anyway, like 10 minutes later, for whatever reason, the owner went to the store. The owner of the dress was in the store. She told her, and she called me right away, and she was so excited because this dress was so meaningful to her and her family, and she was held on to it forever. And she was finally like, okay, I need to let it go. I need to let somebody else enjoy this dress. But the reason it was so meaningful is because her family immigrated to Canada from Russia, and it was her great aunt's dress. But she proceeds to tell me the whole story behind the dress. So the family immigrates, and it's like a horse and buggy and like 13 kids, and they go through to the Ukraine, and then they have to, they come to Canada, and they come through Pier 21, which is in Halifax here, and they go out west, and there were farmers, and they started farming, but then there was floods, and so they were relocated back to Ontario. They started farming again. Anyway, long story short, her great aunt was the first one to ever graduate from high school. This family had been through so much turmoil and finally was like doing a little bit better. And so they went to New York City, and that's where she bought this Vogue Miss dress for her high school graduation. And that
wow.
And no,
I got goosebumps. Like, what an awesome story.
Chills. And I love that aspect. So again, the paintings maybe just look pretty, but I'm really trying to find real life models, real life clothes with real stories, because that is really behind the beauty. That's the catalyst of why I'm interested in it so much. And then the other thing though is now, so now I'm older and climate, and I'm on social media, and it's the freaking Shein hauls and the fast fashion. And so now, as much as I love identity and fashion over here, I'm like, oh, what are we doing with fast fashion over there? And we're ruining the planet. And the more I dig into like the fashion world, it's so destructive to our planet that it's hard. I have an internal conflict between this love and what it does for us versus how we're ruining the planet with it. So I've also started, and because of the story, I've tried to incorporate a lot of like vintage finds and thrifted finds and finds into the work. So yeah, I don't know. So there's this other whole thing that I'm like torn on a little bit, because it's like I'm almost promoting fashion, but like I have this internal thing where fashion can be so destructive. So anyway.
Well, and I think it's right, because the other thing too is I think that one could argue, especially with social media, that fashion can also be destructive, sort of emotionally and mentally as well. Like, you had and I had our own sense of fashion where you didn't want to look like everybody else, but a lot of people do want to copy those icons and chase that and never measure up, right? Which is also kind of such a challenge with fashion.
Well, a controversial thing that I'm going to say here that you hear all the time that people say about like Jackie O, right? They're like, oh, Jackie O, her fashion, it's so timeless. It's so timeless. And I'm like on the polar opposite. I'm like, I don't want timeless. I love that if you're looking at Victorian fashion, you know the era that it came from, what was going on. If you look at 80s fashion, you have an idea of like the trends and the environment.
Yeah, the colors, the satin, the shininess.
Yeah, I love that fashion can like almost transport you into a time or place. Like, I think that's really cool. And now it's almost like you said, the homogeneousness, it's not a word, but just made it up, of fashion sometimes, and everybody wanting to be the same is kind of heartbreaking to me. Like,
yeah.
You know, but then on the flip side, so my kids are this Gen Z and they're going into the thrifting again, and like what's old is new, but they're reinventing it for themselves. And I really love that. So I'm hoping that instead of fast fashion, and there's so much out there that we can like reinvent. And there's a bunch of Instagram people and TikTokers that I follow who are doing that. They're going and they're taking remnants. Like there's one called, Daniel, gosh, what is his tag? Ooh, Zero Waste Daniel. If you go check him out on Instagram, he is in New York, and so he doesn't buy fabric. He takes remnants. And when I say remnants, I mean like tiny squares like this that all the fashion houses throw in the dumpsters, and he creates new clothing with stuff that was literally going to go in a landfill. And I'm like,
wow, that's cool.
Yeah, I love that. And then also there's other ones that will take old fashion or discarded fashion and they chop it up and then reuse the fabric that way, right? So yeah. I love this new movement of what's old is new, and then creating something that's reflective of this generation where we are worried about climate change and how our impact and obsession with luxury and commercialism and consumerism is impacting the planet.
Yeah, well, it's interesting too, because I think a lot of fiber artists also do that, you know, where they're kind of taking sweaters and fashion and fiber and making their own fibers and dyeing them. And some of it is going back to the really old traditional ways of doing fabric, and then kind of creating new art out of it, which I always find is fascinating too.
Yeah. And even like for my own practice, it's funny because I know art can be wasteful as well. So even though I'm sourcing like vintage thrifted clothes to take my references for my paintings, I haven't done it yet, but I've like dabbled, because when I'm in the thrift stores, you're in the sheet section and you see these beautiful like linen or cotton king size sheets or whatever. I'm like, what if I could use those to paint on, like stretch those and gesso those, and then I'm not like, because cotton is terrible for the planet, right? So if it's already cotton that's been produced and I can use that, like, I don't know, like I'm sort of trying to figure out in my own ways how to not be part of the problem too. So.
Well, and I think sometimes I find it's kind of a little bit of an intellectual challenge too, because when I put my colors out, I use probably about 30 colors on my palette. So I have a lot of colors on my palette. And I have this kind of thing with myself, because acrylic dries quickly. So you can't, like oil, you can't just leave it. So I have a thing that I use all the paint on my palette all the time, which means that I sometimes end up at the end of the day with colors or, I don't know, color palette that I wouldn't normally necessarily work on.
I love that.
So it's kind of a fun.
So cool. It's like a limitation or challenge, right? Like if I'm going to squeeze this out, I'm going to use. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's cool.
It's kind of fun.
Yeah. And actually, it's funny because like tips and tricks that I've learned with oil painting. So again, the chemicals and like the mineral spirits or whatever to clean your brushes, right? And I'm like, oh my God, this liquid, like you have to take it to the recycling depot and it's terrible. But magic of YouTube, I saw this guy and he got some pickle jars that were empty. And every time he's done with his mineral spirits, he dumps it in the pickle jar and he just leaves them for a few months. And then you have like, so I have like 3 or 4 pickle jars. And then the one that sits, all of the paint settles to the bottom and you can pour off the top clarified spirits and reuse it. So I've been painting now with oils since 2019. I've only ever bought one gallon of mineral spirits and I just keep recycling it. And the old paint settles to the bottom and eventually it'll fill up a jar, I'm sure. But I don't know. I just like.
And that's a whole other piece of art you could sell.
Yeah, I don't know. Like I'm doing my best to try to create sustainably, So
yeah, I think that's important.
The best, right?
So we only have about 7 minutes left, but one of the things I did want to talk to you about, because I just love, is your How to Make $1 Million you've been talking about.
Okay.
Because I am always on the fence about, should I do prints? Should I not do prints? I'm not sure. I'm thinking about it for another year. I'm going to make a decision this year.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
Okay, so that came about because, again, the wonders of social media. I saw this graphic that was like, here's how you make $1 million. And they broke it down. And when I saw it broken down, I'm like, oh my God, that's not as far-fetched. I mean, don't get me wrong. It's still challenging. But the line that I focused in on was, it said, if you sell something that's $200, you only need to sell 5,000 to make $1 million. And for me, that was like an epiphany because there's 8 billion people on the planet. So my prints, I have large and small. So my large prints sell for $195. So let's say $200. So I was like, if I could connect with only 5,000 people out of 8 billion who really love and connect with my work and decide, okay, I'm going to invest in this person because I love what she's doing. I love her work. I'm going to buy a print. Then wonders of wonders, I might actually be able to make $1 million. And if not $1 million, like I've circled back on that. Like, even if I only sold 100 prints, right? Like, it's a good chunk of money.
And you're only making 500,000.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Right. Like, it's as artists. And so why I really started talking about that and talking about money is because I feel like a lot of people in general, but specifically in the art world, are very secretive about what things cost, what they sell for. Like, you'll see artists post a piece of work, but then it's like, you got to jump through hoops if you want to buy it. And I'm just like, you know what? In every other industry, even in the housing market, $1 million houses, you go on MLS and the price is listed. So why are we so secretive? Why are we hiding the fact that we are trying to make a living from what we're creating? Like, I just didn't understand it. And so I just wanted to be able to have something that I could jump off of and keep the conversation about money and selling art. And that, I know, you know, when I was studying, two people were like, oh, you know, if you always are talking about selling your work or that it's for sale, you're like a sellout. You should just be into the creative process. And in like, I don't have a rich daddy bankrolling my life. Like I need to earn.
Well, and I have a personal pet peeve with that whole concept too, because this is really the first generation of artists that have been allowed to just do whatever you want. I mean, Michelangelo and all those people, they had sponsors. They had to do what was requested of them, and then they delivered it. But I think that you're right. I think the other part that I find I agree with that needs to be talked about more, and that I always talk about in our mentoring groups, is the fact that exactly when people say to you, if you talk about selling your art, then you're a sellout, is feeding into this whole stereotype of an artist has to be poverty stricken. And you have to to be a true artist and to truly follow your dream, you have to be willing to make no money at all, which I think is just a completely irrational conversation. And I think that when you have artists that, you know, their dream is to make $25,000 a year, like that's kind of ridiculous. Like nobody can live on that. Like why isn't your dream $80,000 a year, $100,000, $200,000 a year?
Yeah.
And you might not hit it, but having that goal in your mind makes it a much higher chance you're going to make more than, you know, $10,000, $20,000 on your art.
Yeah.
And it's possible.
And the reason I got fixated on the prints too is because, again, that was a big debate when I was starting. I would ask artists, what do you think? And some, you know, really poo-pooed it. Oh, you're lowering the level of
diluting your value of your brand.
Do that. And then other people were like, but I could never afford a $3,000 painting, but I can afford a $200, you know, print or whatever. So anyway, there's all of that. The fact is, I'm a slow painter. I do not produce a painting a day. It takes me weeks, if not months sometimes, to finish a painting. So last year, for example, I only completed in their entirety 6 paintings.
Yeah.
So if I can only sell 6 paintings, even if they're selling, I mean, even if, like you were saying, even if I could sell them for $10,000, which I've never sold a painting at that price yet, but
that's still only $60,000, and that's only your revenue. That's not your profit.
Exactly. So then
yeah.
prints come in. It's like it's a way to supplement your income if you're not producing quickly or if you're not able to sell originals because they're at a higher price point. Like we need to have options as artists to earn a respectable living, like you said, you know, like we have to feed and support our families and, you know, all of that good stuff. So,
and I think the other thing too is I think it's a little bit behooves artists to kind of say, and you know what, when you're that kid that's looking at that census report trying to figure out if you want to have a degree in fine arts, you can make a living as a fine artist. It's a shit ton of work. You got to put your 50% in on the business part of it, but it's totally possible. It's a mindset that has to shift within the industry.
Absolutely.
I think.
Yeah. And I think actually I see a little bit because of COVID when even the big galleries were shut down and they had to start going online, and you start seeing galleries like actually posting their prices of things, like horror of horror. How do you do that? I don't know. But anyway, it was happening. And so I think when the big guys start doing it, it trickles down to those of us sort of just starting out, right? So I think I think there's going to be change there. I think it's coming. And that's what the project is. Like, I want to make it, if I talk about it, and I'm trying to be like uber transparent, which feels vulnerable and a little scary, but I'm talking like all the behind the scenes of what goes in and how I'm making money and how much I'm making. Like, I'm really putting it out there in an effort to encourage others that you can make a living, even if it means you're putting different pieces together, prints, originals, coaching, like whatever your skill level and interests are, that by doing that, you can be successful. And maybe you never thought of things, and I'm going to talk about it, and you're like, oh, I didn't realize that was possible. And here you go. She did it, so now I can do it too. Yeah,
exactly. Well, good for you. That's an excellent way to end, because we're right at the end of our interview. We've hit 55 minutes. Can you believe it? I could have talked to you for another hour.
I know. It was so fun. Loved it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And this will be posted on my Instagram. I'll tag you so you can share the link. It will eventually be on my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/KTaylorArt. And at some point, it will be on my podcast, Talking to Artists.
Perfect.
So,
okay, Kate.
thank you very much.
Thanks.
I really enjoyed chatting with you.
You too.
Thanks.
Bye.
And next week we've got finally convinced Jody Wheeler of Blue Crow Gallery to come and talk to me every time I have her scheduled. She's got lots of other stuff going on and COVID gets in the way. So looking forward to chatting with her. Have a fabulous creative day. Whoops, there's my timer. And we'll talk to you later. Bye.